Welcome to the demonstration for joint venture project sets in Oracle Fusion Joint Venture Management. You can now use joint venture project sets to determine which transactions to process based on their project attributes. Many organizations engaged in joint ventures manage their projects in Oracle Fusion Cloud Project Management. The projects consist of different project numbers, task numbers, and expenditure types, and some might not be distributable or billable to the stakeholders. Managing partners need an easy and flexible way to identify these projects and transactions in joint venture management. Joint venture project sets eliminate the need to manually enter and maintain project attributes in joint venture distributable project values and joint venture ownership definition assignment rules. The following demo will show how you can use joint venture project sets to enhance your business. Let's look at a business scenario at HEPP Petroleum. HEPP Petroleum is the managing partner in the joint venture Permian Alpha Development. The other partners in the joint venture are Best Rig and Beijing Super Petroleum. According to the joint operating agreement, transactions for all accounts are distributable to the joint venture. Specific types of costs associated with specific capital projects are billable to the joint venture stakeholders HEPP Petroleum, Best Rig, and Beijing Super Petroleum, with ownership percentages 60, 25, and 15 respectively. All operational expenditures except employee travel expenses are billable to the stakeholders with ownership percentages 60, 20, and 20. All expenses that are not associated with a capital project or an operational project are billable to the joint venture stakeholders with ownership percentages 60, 25, and 15 respectively. Let's familiarize ourselves with the data that I'll be using in the example. HEPP Petroleum has a number of projects. Of these, Permian Alpha Develop and Permian Delta are capital projects, while the rest are operational projects. The projects Permian Alpha Develop, Permian East Well 1, Permian East Well 2, Permian East Well 3, and Permian East Well 4 are associated with the joint venture Permian Alpha. The other projects are not part of the joint venture. Here are some of the expenditure types that are used on the projects. Here is a subset of the transactions that have been posted for January 2017. 9 of these transactions have project attributes. The last transaction is not associated with any project. According to the joint operating agreement, all transactions for cost center 6400 are billable to the stakeholders. Additionally, when the transaction is associated with a project, only transactions associated with the project Permian Alpha Develop and expenditure types material, equipment, and electrical works in the projects Permian East Well 1, Permian East Well 2, Permian East Well 3, and Permian East Well 4 for all expenditure type other than airfare are billable to the stakeholders. Based on the criteria for joint venture processing, transactions 3, 5, 7, 9, and 10 are distributable to the joint venture stakeholders. Now that we have determined which transactions are distributable, let's see what ownership percentages to apply to each of these transactions. Specific types of costs associated with capital projects are billable to the stakeholders on the joint venture with ownership percentages 60, 25, and 15 for HEPP Petroleum, Best Rig, and Beijing Super Petroleum. All operational expenditures except employee travel expenses are billable to the joint venture stakeholders with ownership percentages 60, 20, and 20. All other expenses that are not related to any projects are billable to the joint venture stakeholders with ownership percentages 60, 25, and 15. Let's see how it's possible to use project sets at HEPP Petroleum. There are 2 places where you can use joint venture project sets. First, use a project set instead of distributable project values in the joint venture definition to determine which transactions to process based on their project attributes. Second, Use project sets and ownership definition assignment rules to determine which transactions with project attributes to assign a specific ownership definition. Let's see how it's possible to use project sets to identify transactions for processing and to assign ownership definitions based on project attributes easily. The joint venture accountant or the joint venture application administrator for the joint venture Permian Alpha creates the following setup. Creates the 3 joint venture project sets to identify the project attributes. Project set 1 to identify all the distributable projects and expenditure types for the joint venture. Project set 2 to identify the ownership for capital projects that will be billable to partners. Project set 3 to identify the ownership for operational projects that will be billable to partners. Associates project set 1 to the joint venture definition for the joint venture Permian Alpha development in the Project Information tab. Creates 2 joint venture ownership assignment rules. Ownership definition assignment rule 1 to assign the ownership percentage with ratio 60 to 25-15 for capital projects using project set 2. Ownership definition assignment rule 2 to assign the ownership percentage with ratio 60 to 20-20 for operational projects using project set 3. Let's begin by looking at how the project sets can be set up. Navigate to the Task Manage Joint Venture Project Sets from Setup and Maintenance for the Financials functional area. The joint venture accountant for the joint venture Permian Alpha creates the following joint venture project sets to identify the project attributes. Project set Permian distributable projects to identify all the distributable projects and expenditure types for the joint venture. Project set Permian Capex 60-25-15 to identify the ownership for capital projects that will be billable to partners. Project set Permian OPEX 60-20-20 to identify the ownership for operational projects that will be billable to partners. Let's look at each of these project sets individually. There are 2 filter sets. One to identify the project number and expenditure type for the capital projects. Another to identify the project number and expenditure type for the operational projects. The operators provide an efficient way to identify project values. Match as any operator is for providing a list of values. The is operator is used for exact matching. Here, it is used to match with the project number Permian Alpha developed. The is not operator is for exclusion and can be used on its own or in conjunction with between and starts with operator. Here, it is used to exclude the expenditure type airfare. The between operator is for giving a range of values. Hence, all projects with project numbers, Permian East Well 1, Permian East Well 2, Permian East Well 3, and Permian East Well 4 are included. There is also the starts with operator to provide a starting keyword. Recall the terms of the joint operating agreement on the type of project costs that are billable to the stakeholders. For the capital project, Permian Alpha develop, transactions that have the expenditure types, electrical works, equipment, and material are billable to the stakeholders. For the operational projects, Permian East Well 1, Permian East Well 2, Permian East Well 3, and Permian East Well 4, all expenses except airfare are billable to the stakeholders. We will use this project set instead of the distributable project values on the joint venture definition to identify transactions that are distributable based on project attributes. Next, let's look at the project set, Permian Capex 60-25-15. This project set will be used to identify the ownership percentage to be used for distributing transactions for capital expenditures. The filter set identifies transactions that have the project number Permian Alpha developed with expenditure types, electrical works, equipment, and material. Next, let's look at the project set, Permian OPEX 60-20-20. This project set will be used to identify the ownership percentage to be used for distributing transactions for operational expenses. The filter set identifies the transactions that have expenditure type other than airfare for projects Permian East Well 1, Permian East Well 2, Permian East Well 3, and Permian East Well 4. You can also manage the joint venture project sets in an Excel spreadsheet. Now that we have created the project sets, let's use them for joint venture processing. Let's look at the joint venture definition for the joint venture Permian Alpha. Here we have the basic properties. Next, let's look at the account information. Note that an account set's been selected to define distributable accounts for the joint venture Permian Alpha. According to the joint operating agreement, transactions for all accounts are distributable to the joint venture. Cost Center 6400 has been defined as the primary segment value for this joint venture. Here is the definition for the account set, distributable accounts. Hence, transactions for Cost Center 6400 that have been defined as distributable on the account set named distributable accounts will be identified for joint venture processing. Next, let's look at the project information. The project selection method is set as project set. The project set is Permian distributable projects. Prior to the introduction of project sets, the only way to specify the project attributes was to manually enter and maintain the project attributes in distributable project values page for each joint venture. Next, let's look at the stakeholders that have been defined for this joint venture. Beijing Super Petroleum and Best Rig are external stakeholders. The managing partner HEPP Petroleum is represented by Permian Blue Star. Let's look at the ownership definitions. There are 3 ownership definitions. This is the ownership definition for the capital expenses. According to the joint operating agreement, specific types of costs associated with capital projects are billable to the joint venture stakeholders HEPP Petroleum, Best Rig, and Beijing Super Petroleum with ownership percentages 60, 25 and 15 respectively. The next ownership definition corresponds to the one for operational projects. According to the joint operating agreement, all operational expenditures except employee travel expenses are billable to the stakeholder with ownership percentages 60, 20 and 20. As defined in the joint operating agreement, all other expenses are billable to the joint venture partners with ownership percentage 60, 25, and 15. A new ownership definition is created for this and will be used as the default for transactions that are not assigned an ownership definition through ownership definition assignment rules. Now that we have looked at the joint venture definition and the ownership definitions, let's look at how we can use the project sets in ownership definition assignment rules. There are 2 ownership definition assignment rules. One to designate the ownership definition to be used for capital expenses, and another to designate the ownership definition to be used for operational expenses. As previously explained, for all other expenses, the default ownership definition on the joint venture definition will be used. Let's look at the assignment rule for capital expenses. The assignment rule is for the joint venture Permian Alpha. The ownership definition to be used is Permian CAPEX 60-25-15. The project selection method is project set and the project set to be used is Permian CAPEX 60-25-15. You also have the ability to enter the project attributes individually if you want to by selecting the project selection method as project values. This is the assignment rule for operational expenses. The ownership definition to be used is Permian OPEX 60-20-20. The project selection method is project set and the project set to be used is Permian OPEX 60-2020. Here is an assignment rule that uses the project values instead of a project set. The project selection method is project values. Here, I have specified the project values individually. As you can see, using a project set is much more flexible than project values. Now that we have looked at how we can create project sets and use them on the joint venture definition and ownership definition assignment rules, let's see how they are used in joint venture processing. These are the transactions for January 2017 that are available for processing. According to the Joint Operating Agreement, only the 5 transactions that are marked as distributable, yes, are eligible to be billed to the joint venture stakeholders. Let's run the process to identify the transactions for January 2017. I have selected the period as January 2017. Select Yes for the parameter process ownership definition assignment rules. Select No for the parameter bypass default ownership definition assignment. Verify that the process completed successfully. Note that 5 transactions have been identified for joint venture processing. The ownership definition assignment rules have been processed for these transactions. Here are the 5 identified transactions in the joint venture transactions work area. Note that the status is available to process. When the project number is Permian Alpha Develop and expenditure type is equipment or material, the ownership percentages are 60, 25, and 15. When the project number is Permian East Well 1 or Permian East Well 2, all transactions with expenditure type other than airfare are distributed with ownership percentage 60, 20, and 20. The remaining transaction that is not associated with a project is distributed with ownership percentage 60, 25, and 15. This concludes this demonstration.